Now that we have the basics down, let's take a look at the rest of the rigid body settings. First option here, shape, is what Blender uses to calculate collisions. The default, convex hole, saves memory by calculating only the outside boundary of the mesh and ignoring concave features. So if we play this back, you'll see that the monkey won't actually fall into the bowl, and it's like we wrapped a bunch of tape around this. So it's completely ignoring the inside features. But there's a few other shapes that we can use. If you have a really simple object, you can use one of these like box or sphere, and it's going to use that shape instead. You'll see that it's not quite around the outside of our mesh, and that's because the shape of the box is determined by the dimensions, but also the object origin. The object origin in rigid bodies is really important because it's where the center of mass is. So to place this in a more accurate area, let's go to the toolbar, and under Set Origin, let's set origin to the center of the mass, and that way it'll correctly place the center of mass, but also correctly place the shape of the box. Now we could also set that to a sphere, capsule, cylinder, or cone. But lastly we have this mesh option, and that's going to use the actual faces of the mesh to calculate the simulation. So it's a little bit more expensive, but it also gives the most accurate results. So now when we play our animation, the monkey will actually fall into the bowl, and everything looks good. Underneath the mesh is the source. The source is which part of the mesh data is being used by the simulation. So the option at the bottom, base, is just the basic mesh that you would see if you went into edit mode. Deform is going to use things like modifiers or shape keys as well, and final will include everything that you see in the viewport. Now if we keep this at base and we go to our mesh data panel, I have a shape key for this bowl. Turn it all the way up, you'll see it just shrinks a lot. So let's play this back, and you can see that the monkey completely ignores the shape key. But if we set this to deform, then it'll use that shape key in the simulation. Now if you're animating your shape key, you're going to want to check this deforming checkbox right here, just to tell Blender to constantly be checking for that deformation. So it's definitely going to be more expensive because it's going to have to calculate every single step, but it'll definitely give you good results if that's what you need to do. And lastly, final will just give you the final result of the mesh, and so of course that'll give us a nice result as well, but also be more expensive. So let me just turn that shape key off really quick. So under that we have the surface response. The first option is friction. If we set this to a really low value, it's going to be really slippery and slip around. Just like that, it won't really grab hold of the surface. And if we set this really high, it's going to be a little bit more like Velcro. I guess that's a little bit hard to see, so let me rotate the plane a little bit and do that again. There we go. So now you can see that's where it's really slippery. And if we set this to a high value, then it's going to stick to the surface quite a bit more. Now underneath that we have bounciness option. And this is a really fun one. But if we set this all the way to 1 and we play this back, we're not going to see much of a difference. Because both objects that are colliding need to be at least a little bit bouncy in order for this to work. So if we set both the plane and the monkey to be bouncy, then we'll definitely see a difference. Then they'll bounce around. Now, if it's not bouncing enough, you can definitely increase the mass, and doing that will make it heavier, meaning there's more force, and that means it's going to bounce up a little bit higher. Alright, right next to that is the sensitivity. So we have a collision margin, and this is just going to add a little bit of extra padding around the shape. So let's just do that for this bowl right here. So if we set the margin to 1 and we play this back, you'll see that the monkey doesn't actually come in contact with the bowl, and the bowl doesn't come in contact with the floor. We have that extra padding around it. And the lower we set this, the closer to the actual mesh it's going to be. We can set that all the way to 0, but it's good to usually have a little bit of padding if you're using the mesh shape. If you're using convex hole, or any of the other shapes, it's off by default. Now underneath both of those we have collision groups, and these are a little bit more like collision layers in my opinion, but they're called collision groups. And everything that's on the same group or layer will interact with the other objects on it. So since they're all on the first group right now, they're all going to interact, but if we move the bowl to the second group, then it's going to ignore all of the other objects. Now we can assign an object to multiple groups by just shift clicking. So now this plane is going to interact with both the bull and the monkey, but the bull and the monkey won't interact with each other. So this can be really helpful in very complex scenes, but in most cases, I don't use it all that often. Lastly, we have this dynamics panel. The deactivation option is super useful, and it's where Blender basically turns off the simulation for the object when it's standing still, so it won't suck up memory while doing nothing. The linear and angular velocity settings determine how slow it needs to move or rotate before it's considered at rest. So let's clear the rotation of this and turn off the bounciness so things won't get crazy. And now if we set the deactivation velocities really, really high, I can just set both the linear velocity and angular velocity. One is for movement, one is for rotation, by clicking and dragging down. So I'm changing both at the same time, and then just dragging to the right. So if we set those both really, really high, then you'll see at some point they're just going to stop and freeze completely. So the lower you set this, the longer it'll take for it to freeze. So I can reset these both just by clicking on the first one, dragging down to the second one, and then typing in 0.4. And last but not least, we have the damping options, which are just going to slow down your object and make it resist moving. So if we go back to our first frame and turn these both up really, really high, then it's going to resist moving and rotating quite a bit. However, if we only do moving and not rotating, then you'll see that it rotates very freely, but it doesn't like to move. Both of those on, it's sort of like it's sinking through a pit of mud or something. Another really helpful option that I almost forgot to mention is Start Deactivated. And what this one does is allows the object to stay frozen until it comes in contact with another rigid body. So if I enable this on the bull and play back the simulation, it's going to stay hovering in midair until the monkey comes close to it. Now if we enable this on the monkey as well, then they're both going to stay completely frozen until they come really, really close to each other, in which case they're both going to fall down. So this is helpful if you have like a ball hitting a brick wall or anything like that. So those are all of the rigid body options. In the next video, we're going to take a look at rigid body constraints.